All right. So welcome and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Vanessa Sung. I'm the Interim Executive Director for Evidence for Democracy. And with me here today is Sarah Laframboise, who's the Executive Director of Support Our Science. We'll get into what our respective organizations do shortly, but before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge that we are both speaking to you today from Ottawa, which is located on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. Today we'll be talking about budgets, and as we will soon discuss, budgets really tell us what the government's priorities are, because we spend money on what we value. And in preparing today's land acknowledgement, my mind kept going back to a book that I read late last year. It's called Valley of the Birdtail, and it's a beautifully written book about two towns separated only by a valley, one a white town and the other an Indian reserve, and the different paths these towns took over the course of 100 years. And there's an excerpt from the book that has really stayed with me, and I'd like to take a minute to share that with you now. So this excerpt is about when Jean Chrétien was elected prime minister in 1993. And at the time, his government was facing a very significant deficit. And his finance minister, Paul Martin, at the time promised to tame the deficit come hell or high water. So as part of Paul Martin's plan, a 2% cap was placed on annual spending increases for services on reserves. So by 1998, the government was back to running budget surpluses, yet the 2% spending cap would remain in place for almost 2 more decades until 2016. Michael Wernick, who served as Deputy Minister of Indian Affairs between 2006 and 2014, observes, every single year for close to 20 years, ministers of finance from the Chrétien government, the Martin government, and the Harper government had the opportunity to change it, but they didn't. Spending less was a choice that was made repeatedly year after year. At the time the cap was implemented, Scott Sturson, who was the Deputy Minister of Indian Affairs at the time, says he thought it was about defeating the deficit, not holding a group of Canadian citizens at an insufficient level for 22 years. He went on to write that it is only reasonable to conclude that the deliberate but unstated policy of the Canadian government is to maintain the vast majority of First Nations in poverty. In a 2012 interview, Paul Martin said, the cap was a mistake and there's no excuse for it. So, like I said, that's really stayed with me, and I invite you to let that excerpt sit with you and reflect on how we can all do better, do our best to stand in solidarity and to advocate for those who were here first. Nada, can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, so for those of you meeting us for the first time, Evidence for Democracy, or E4D for short, is the leading nonprofit organization in Canada promoting and advocating for the transparent use of evidence in government decision-making. We do this work because we believe that we all benefit when governments make decisions informed by the best available evidence, and our efforts include ensuring that the science that builds the evidence base to inform decision-making is adequately supported in Canada. And today we're really pleased to be hosting a webinar with Support Our Science on how to write a pre-budget submission, and also to discuss key considerations for Budget 24 with a couple of people who have thought deeply about what the Canadian science ecosystem needs. And one of them is Sarah. And Sarah, would you like to introduce yourself, your organization, and also share any opening remarks?
Yeah, thank you so much, Vanessa, and thank you for hosting this today. So my name is Sarah Laframboise. I'm a current PhD student at the University of Ottawa studying biochemistry. And recently I was elected the Executive Director of Support Our Science. Support Our Science is a very grassroots organization. We do scrappy advocacy over the last year with one clear mandate, and that's been to increase pay for all graduate students and postdoctoral scholars in Canada. Pre-budget submissions are a really important and vital part of Canadian politics. We submitted a pre-budget submission in the previous budget for 2023. And I'll talk about some of our asks that were in the last year's pre-budget and this year. I'm excited to learn more today about how this process works as well, and also to give some evidence on kind of what went into our asks that support our science and how you can use those in your own advocacy efforts as well. And I hope that some of the things that we'll talk about today will resonate with the crowd today, and you can all kind of use these tools and resources to include in your own pre-budget submissions.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Now, before we dive in, just a few housekeeping notes. The chat and the Q&A functions are both available to you today. Although we'd ask that if you have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A so that it's easier for my team to find them for me. If you have any comments to share or resources, please, we encourage you to put them into the chat. And finally, closed captions is also available, so please feel free to enable them if you like. Next slide, please. Okay, so today's webinar is going to be roughly an hour and a half long, which is a bit longer than usual because we're actually trying to do a couple of things here. So in the first part of the webinar, I'm going to go over the basics of the budget process, what it is and how to participate. And then in the second part of the webinar, we'll hear from Sarah and our special guest, Dr. Frédéric Bouchard, who will be joining us later. So we'll be discussing issues that are important for budget 2024 and then have a general discussion about them. Next slide. Okay, so first things first. What is a budget and why do we care about it? Well, every spring, the Minister of Finance tables a federal budget in the House of Commons. And in a practical sense, the budget tells us how the government will spend and tax over the coming fiscal year and beyond, because a lot of the funding that's announced often stretches over multiple years. But it's also an extremely important document to our democracy, because if it's not passed in the House of Commons, the government is effectively defeated because it loses its spending power. So the vote on the budget is actually a vote on the government itself. And from a policy perspective, the budget is a key document that tells us where the government's priorities are. Next slide, please. Okay, so it's important to note that that budgets are highly political documents. And we put a selection of budget titles over the past 10 years on the screen so that you can see that the titles themselves actually tell you quite a bit about the priorities of the governing party. So the top two are liberal budgets. And you can see the theme there is they like to talk about the middle class. And then the bottom two are budgets from the conservatives. And the theme there is very much balancing the budget. Next slide. Right. Okay, so beyond political priorities, we also see that budgets definitely respond to external forces. So COVID-19 is an obvious example of this. While we didn't see a budget in 2020, we saw record levels of federal spending as the government worked to respond to the pandemic. And even in budget 2021, we continue to see kind of large ticket items that are continuing to deal with kind of the fallout from the pandemic, like long-term care, universal broadband, by manufacturing, but at that point, kind of with an eye to kind of move past the pandemic and to recover the economy. Now, budgets are also impacted by what's happening internationally. So for example, last year, President Biden signed into law the Inflation Reduction Act, which included the most extensive investment in climate solutions in US history. So this has put a lot of pressure on Canada to make similar commitments. for fear of losing green investments, developments to the US. Next slide, please. And indeed, in budget 2023, one of the key elements, the key themes in the budget was growing a green economy. Next slide. Okay, so here we've put kind of a selection of some of the science and research related investments, and you can find a fuller analysis on our website on all the science and research related investments in the budget. But here, just to point out some of the key ones, we saw some money go to colleges, which is great. And then kind of a smattering of kind of targeted or investments to targeted areas of research. Next slide. Okay, great. But what we didn't see were any increases to the core funding for the federal funding agencies. And neither did the budget address the longstanding challenges in Canada's science and research ecosystem. And in fact, what we did see in the budget was a bit of an IOU from the government, pointing to the report of the advisory panel on the federal research support system, bit of a mouthful, stating that it's carefully considering the advisory panel's advice, and that more details are forthcoming. And we will talk about the advisory panel's recommendations later on the webinar once with Dr. Bouchard, who chaired that panel. Next slide. So the lack of kind of broad investments in Canada's science and research ecosystem is kind of happening against a backdrop where Canada has consistently underperformed against our peer nations and the OECD average in terms of R&D investments as a share of GDP. Okay, so this is a graph from the OECD, very fresh. I pulled it this morning. So you can see, the lines on the graph are the G7 nations, and the dark black is the OECD average, and the red is Canada. So, you know, I think the key thing to note here is that Canada is the only country among the G7 where R&D investments have actually been declining over the past 2 decades, whereas nearly every other country has been increasing over the past 2 decades. Next slide. Okay, so how is a budget made? So broadly, there are 3 phases. So there's the pre-budget consultation phase, which is where we are right now. And then the budget information, where the budget is released to the public. And then finally, the budget is tabled in the House of Commons to be voted on and passed. Next slide. So my predecessors here at E4D have been using a bread baking analogy for how a budget is made, and I kind of love it, so I'm going to keep using it. So basically, in kind of late summer to early fall, which is the stage that we're in right now, it's really the government is collecting information. So in this analogy would be we're collecting the ingredients to make a budget. So right now the Parliamentary Committee on Finance has rolled out this process to consult the members of the public, different organizations, institutions, special interest group, other stakeholders, to really gather information about what people want to see in this next budget. And then in September to November in the fall time, there's another process where some of that information is going to be fed into a second process where the Department of Finance also holds their own consultation process. So to clarify, going back to Parliamentary Finance Committee is made up of a group of MPs, whereas the Department of Finance process, this is really a public servant audience. And all of that information is going to come together into a mixing bowl and kneaded into, a bread dough that's going to go into the oven in December and into early in the new year. And once it's in the oven during this time, it's very unlikely for any major changes to be made to the budget at this point. It can happen, but it's quite rare, and it's kind of half-baked, as some might call it. And then in February, a fresh budget, a fresh loaf of bread. Although lately it's kind of been a little bit later than that. This year it was the end of March. Sometimes it's even gone into kind of early April. Okay, I hope that wasn't too convoluted an analogy. Next slide, please. Okay, so this illustration comes from the Library of Parliament, and it is too complicated for our purposes today. But what it's showing you is kind of a budget cycle as it relates to the government's fiscal year. And the point that I'd like to get across here is that it really is a cycle and is ongoing at all times. So if you think back, Budget 2023 was released at the end of March this year. It was voted on and passed in June, and now we're already talking about Budget 2024. And the point here is that there's something happening with a budget at all times throughout the government fiscal year. And that means there are many opportunities to try and influence government priorities via the budget. So even if you miss the consultation stages of one budget, the next opportunity is probably coming up pretty soon. And also, there are opportunities to influence budget implementation after a budget has been released as well. So the budget provides kind of buckets of money, and the details are often worked out after the fact. So again, there are more kind of opportunities to engage even after a budget has been finalized and released. Next slide. Okay, so how can you be a part of the process? We do have a full kind of federal budget toolkit on our website that goes into how to do this in more detail. But I will take a few minutes to run through some of this now. So first on the list, pre-budget submission. This is our focus today, and it's a process. It's a process that's run by the House of Commons Standing Committee on Finance. That's the full name, and the typical acronym that you'll hear people use is FINA. So if you ever hear people say FINA submission, that's what they're talking about. It's the Parliamentary Committee on Finance. As I mentioned before, it's a parliamentary committee, so it's made up of MPs, and there are MPs from every party on this committee. So it's a multi-partisan group of MPs, and they do this consultation process, and then they submit a report with recommendations to the Department of Finance later in the fall. Another thing you can do is talk to your MPs. And actually, this is a great time to do it in the summertime, because MPs are not sitting in Parliament. They're back in their home constituencies. And so this is a time when they're going to be out in the community, talking to their constituents, trying to figure out, what their supporters or their constituents want. And MPs can also champion issues. They can also submit briefs to the Department of Finance, or they can champion, your issue to their caucus, for example, if it's kind of an opposition party. So, don't kind of miss out on engaging with your MPs directly, particularly in the summer. So following the written submission to FINA, the Parliamentary Committee also conducts a series of hearings. And by submitting a written brief to FINA, you're automatically included in the pool of people they can select from to invite to do an in-person testimony. I believe they are doing in-person hearings this year. So there's always one in Ottawa, but this year I believe they are doing hearings, in-person hearings across multiple cities in Canada as well. So you can keep an eye out for that. In late fall, as I mentioned in the bread baking analogy, there's also going to be a call by the Department of Finance. And again, this is a public service audience, and this is an opportunity for you to reiterate your message to a different audience. This is probably not the time to be making kind of huge new asks or like changing up your message. This is a time to really double down on your message that you've already submitted to the parliamentary committee. And then finally, feedback and closing the loop in February and March, once the budget has come out. You know, it's really important to maintain kind of ongoing relationships with MPs and public servants. Don't just kind of show up when you want something, or when it's time to ask for money in the budget. You know, it's good practice to maintain a relationship. If the budget is good and you kind of see funding going towards kind of what you think is important or what you ask for, make sure to thank them for their efforts. Let them know you can be a resource moving forward, and again, kind of cultivate an ongoing relationship. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's look more closely at pre-budget submissions. Right, so we've talked about some of this already. It's a public consultation process that lets organizations, institutions, and individuals have their say in the federal budget. So the pre-budget submission is a formal brief that's submitted to FINA, and this year the deadline is August 4th. So we do still have a couple of weeks to pull our submissions together. And what you want to do is include facts. It could be opinions, informed opinions, and importantly, recommendations about how the government should spend its resources. And remember that they do receive hundreds of submissions each year, which makes it all the more important that they're hearing from multiple different sources kind of on a specific issue. So in this case, on science and research funding, kind of a coherent message that they're hearing over and over again is very helpful. And generally speaking, they say something like, oh, we'd like to hear from Canadians about their federal budgetary priorities, or something broad like that. In which case you have more leeway to kind of write about what you'd like. But sometimes FINA does have more specific directives, specific themes that they want to hear about. So it is worthwhile to kind of check their website to make sure you have all the right details for a given year. Next slide. Right, so this is a screenshot of the news release that was sent out from the Parliamentary Committee on Finance. Gives you all the information you need. You can find this online. I think Nada is going to drop a link. So it'll link you to all the instructions, and importantly, it also provides you with a template. So they want the brief to be formatted in a specific way. And the template will tell you exactly what you need to do. And you'll note in the last paragraph there, as I mentioned, they are doing hearings in a number of cities across the country this year. Next slide, please. Okay, so your submission, what should it look like? How do you submit it? Talked about most of this already, but it should be under 2,000 words. It should include an introduction that provides context for your recommendations. That's helpful for the reader to understand why it's important to fund the things that you've recommended. Obviously, you should follow the template. And submission is fairly easy. You do it online through their portal, and they provide all the instructions needed. Next slide. So here we are sharing some helpful hints about how to craft your pre-budget submission and what kind of language to use. So it's important to tell a good story, right? Again, as I mentioned, they see hundreds of these a year. And so it's important to make your narrative compelling. Why is it important to fund this thing that you're recommending? Why is it urgent to fund it? And it's important to use the government's language. So what I mean by this is that, the government throughout the year, throughout its tenure, has stated its priorities in a number of different ways. So things like speech from the throne, previous budgets, funding announcements that have happened throughout the year. So you kind of have a sense of where their priorities are. So you want to write your submission in a way that shows how your priorities fit with their priorities and use their language to demonstrate it. So, governments tend to be responsive to issues like economic growth, competitiveness, talent, young people, affordability. So if you can frame your message in a way where it's such that it can be linked to any of these issues, that's always helpful. Make sure to keep it short and use plain language. Remember that these will be read by non-experts, and also that it has to be translated into French or English if you submit in French, which you can do if you prefer. So make sure that it's not overly technical, and follow the template. We've already mentioned that. Next slide. Okay, so it's also important to think a little bit about the bigger picture. So big questions you can ask, or something to consider would be, what do you think was missing in the previous budget, and how would your recommendations address this gap? And in thinking about this, it's helpful to kind of look around and see what other people have already been recommending. And it's important to align your message, if you can, with others in your sector or in the science and research ecosystem. And, and again, we'll talk a little bit about this later on with Sarah and Dr. Bouchard, but just a few more recommendations right now. You can also look at some of the reports that are already out there. So for example, the Standing Committee on Science and Research have conducted 2 studies already on issues that are very relevant to what we're talking about today. So one on successes, challenges, and opportunities for science in Canada, and one on top talent and research innovation. And each of those have their own kind of set of recommendations that the committee has already made to the government of Canada. So even if you don't agree necessarily with the specific recommendations in there, it's useful to look in those documents for the way that the challenges and the issues have been framed, and you can definitely borrow some of that language. And of course, there's the report of the advisory panel on the federal research support system, which we will talk about a little bit later. Next slide. Yes. Okay. So here are just some things that I think would be helpful to think about as you're crafting your pre-budget submission. And certainly these are the types of things that we're thinking about at E4D. We're still putting together our pre-budget submission, and some of the things we're thinking about is what research is needed today to ensure that we have what we need, the knowledge, the talent, the technologies to inform future policy challenges. What do we hope to see for government science and increasing capacity for federal scientists? What kind of support do we want to see for trainees and early career researchers? And how would our related recommendations impact the future of Canadian productivity, competitiveness, economic growth? And there's lots more to think about, and stay tuned, because we're going to get a lot of important and interesting ideas from our 2 speakers upcoming. Next slide. So let's look at some pre-budget submissions. I think we're going to fly through these fairly quickly, because you can actually find every pre-budget submission that's ever been sent into the committee, or the FINA committee, online on their website. That's actually another great resource. You can go in, look at past pre-budget submissions, look at how they've been formatted, how they've been structured, and how the messages have been framed. That's a great resource. So here is a pre-budget submission from E4D for the 2022 budget. And in this case, we submitted only one kind of overarching recommendation. And then in the body of the brief, we broke it down into kind of the three components of our recommendation. So that's one way to do it. Next slide. So here's another example. This one is from Universities Canada from the 2022 budget, and you'll see that they provided 3 separate recommendations. So that's also good. But remember that, you know, if you check out the template, you'll see, but they kind of want very clear, succinct recommendations in the recommendations portion. So maybe we'll just go very quickly through the next 2 slides. I don't want to take up too much more time. But yeah, so here's another example from the Federation for Humanities and Social Sciences. And then also, of course, next slide, a submission from our friends that support our science for the 2023 pre-budget, or sorry, the 2023 budget. So this I wanted to highlight because this is also a very good way to kind of send in, you know, your ideas. If you or kind of your organization doesn't quite feel prepared to send in your own submission, you can get together with other like-minded organizations or associations or other individuals even, and submit one together and kind of join forces. So you can do that as well. Next slide. Okay, so what happens after you submit a pre-budget brief? So as I mentioned, it's going to get translated. It'll be disseminated with the members of the committee, and it'll be made publicly available. So that's something to remember. Whatever you send in, it's going to be publicly available. So keep that in mind. You'll be in a pool from which you'll be automatically added to a pool from which the committee can choose groups or individuals to testify to the pre-budget hearings. You don't have to do it. If you're invited, you don't have to say yes. But it's a pretty interesting experience. And if you are selected and you feel like you need a little bit of guidance, E4D and Support Our Science both have had experience testifying in front of a committee. So feel free to reach out and we're happy to help you prepare. So these hearings will typically start in September or so and will happen across the country. And then finally, you know, all of these things that the committee hears will get packaged together into a report that will be sent into finance. Next slide. Okay, so I guess we're at the end of this portion of the webinar. At this point, I think we have time to take maybe a couple of questions about the kind of the pre-budget submission process. I think the content or like what can be included, maybe we can save those questions for the second part of the webinar. Because I think there'll be a lot of discussion on that with our 2 speakers. So let me just, okay. So we have a question that asks, in this conversation, when we say science, do we mostly refer to natural sciences? Social sciences based evidence is equally, if not often, more critical for public policy and budget processes. Can we broaden how we use the terms science and evidence to promote a more holistic approach to evidence for democracy? So I mean, I agree with that, absolutely. And typically, for E4D in our past research, we have defined evidence as, any type of qualitative or quantitative data or analysis, and it includes but is not limited to academic literature, government reports, results of consultations, or kind of lived experience. So we do try to be fairly inclusive about what we mean when we talk about science and evidence. Yeah, and in your submission, definitely feel free to be explicit about the inclusiveness of how you're using the term science and evidence. We have maybe one more question about the workshop, or sorry, the pre-budget submission portion. If not, and of course we'll send a follow-up email with though this recording will be available. We'll send a link to the full toolkit that you can check out, and if you'd like more detail. And of course, feel free to reach out to us if you have any follow-up questions. Okay, then next slide, I believe is, okay, so it's time to think about what you want to see in budget 2024 for science and research. And as you think about that, and feel free to share anything you'd like in the chat, we're gonna get our next speaker, which is Sarah, set up. Sarah is a PhD student studying biochemistry at the University of Ottawa. Over the course of her studies, Sarah has been an active member of the science communication and science policy communities. For the last 5 years, she's been a volunteer and staff at the Canadian Science Policy Centre on their editorial committee. Sarah is also the founder and past president of the Ottawa Science Policy Network, a student-run club at the University of Ottawa, as well as a member of the Canada's Chief Science Advisors Youth Council. Congratulations on that. Sarah was recently named the Executive Director of Support Our Science, a grassroots organization advocating for increased funding for graduate students and postdocs in Canada through a series of petitions, national walkouts, rallies, and more. Just a typical overachieving PhD student who deserves more support from the federal government. So with that, I will pass it over to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that a lot. Definitely learning a lot of skills outside of the typical PhD. So happy to always talk about those outside of these conversations. But today I'm really excited to share a bit about Support Our Science and our urgent call for increased funding to graduate students and postdocs. And I hope to give you evidence today on things that you can use in your own advocacy and in your budget submissions. So like I mentioned in the intro, Support Our Science is a really grassroots organization. We are run and operated by graduate students and postdocs who are directly affected by this. And we do, on the topic of inclusive definitions of science, we advocate on behalf of all graduate students and postdocs in Canada. So this includes social sciences, humanities, arts, as well as STEM, which is predominantly takes kind of the attention away from the social sciences sometimes, but at Support Our Science, we're really committed to having representation and great allies within the social sciences and humanities as well. So collectively, we represent over 300,000 graduate students and postdocs, which is a significant amount. I didn't realize there was that many of us in Canada, which is exciting. Support Our Science really started from this graph here. So we can see the award values for the postdoctoral fellowship, the PGSD awards for doctoral candidates, and the CGSM awards for master students. And you can see that the value of these scholarships has remained largely unchanged for almost 20 years. And if we adjust this with inflation, it's an even more critical graph. If we look at the poverty line, it's quite concerning. And the cost of living really has skyrocketed post-COVID and with inflationary measures. And a lot of these awards really haven't kept up to match this. If we look at actual enrollment into graduate programs, this number gets even more troubling, where we're seeing almost double in the amount of students who are enrolling into graduate programs, making these awards really competitive. And if you look at the number of awards, we can see exactly what's going on here, where we have a reduction in the amount of awards that are actually going out. So in summation, the value hasn't changed. We are getting more students enrolling into graduate programs and not enough awards to support that increase. And kind of what are the consequences of this, and why are we here talking about this? I know Vanessa had shared this graph earlier on about the global context, and international comparability and is a really big aspect of this. Canada, again, is the only country in the G7 with a GDP spending on R&D that has decreased since 2001. And this really sets the stage for how competitive we are in comparison to other countries. This is kind of contributing to this aspect of brain drain. This is the loss of our top talent to other countries. This is done by a study at McGill called the TRACE survey. They show that about 38% of PhD graduates are leaving Canada to the US and other countries every year. If we look at what this actually means, this means that we're losing about $740,000 every single year, $740 million every year. And this is lost training dollars that went into those PhD graduates. This number is probably higher with increased enrollment and with brain drain getting even worse. But I think this is a good way to metrically look at this in a way that makes sense to politicians as well. On the note of international competition, we would question why our students are leaving to other countries. And if we look at the stipend values across different countries, we can see just why. So in red, we have the PhD stipends. In blue is the living cost. You ideally would want to live in a country that has a higher PhD stipend than the average cost of living there. We can see that Canada is low in the results here, where we have quite a high cost of living and low PhD stipends across the board. Financial strain and well-being is on top of mind for me as a consequence of this. I'm really fortunate to have worked with an amazing group at the Ottawa Science Policy Network who we were able to publish the survey under peer review, and all of the survey results are here. And basically this whole survey was looking at the financial strain and impact on graduate students in Canada. So I'd recommend, if you're looking for any data on this, to check out our survey results here. But some key highlights: 86% of graduate students across Canada right now are experiencing stress and anxiety about their finances. 38 and 36% are concerned about paying for rent and food. And 31% have considered leaving their studies due to financial concern alone. And if we consider this to be the next generation of research, they're struggling, and they're struggling a lot. And I think this really helps represent that in a quantitative way. So if you're looking for data, this is a great place to look on that. So what exactly were you asking for at Support Our Science? I wanted to make sure that I went over this to echo what Vanessa was saying about the need for things to be very unified in our messaging. And I would encourage people, if they feel like this aligns with your organization, to adopt some of these asks. So I think the more unified we are in this messaging, the better. But to start off, we're recommending an increase to the value of the tri-agency graduate student scholarships and postdoctoral fellowships by 50%. With the exemption of the PGSD award, we would just say that we would want those, the PGSD and the CGSD, to be normalized to $35,000. There's two distinct scholarships for doctoral students. One is at $21,000 and one's at $35,000 right now. So we just want those to be brought up to $35,000. We're also advocating to increase the number of tri-agency graduate student scholarships by 50%. That way we would have more students who are able to benefit from those graduate student scholarships. We're also advocating to increase the number of tri-agency postdoctoral fellowships by 100%, so to double them. This is because the doctoral scholarships postdoctoral scholarships have taken a bit of a larger hit in the number of awards that were given out in order to increase the value of those fellowships. And then to top this off, we're advocating for an indexation of all these scholarships and fellowships to inflation going forward. And this is also to emphasize the fact that this 50% is based off of the inflation in the last 20 years. So that's why we decided on all of these values. was to really match them with inflation for the last 20 years since those values haven't been increased. And to give you a dollar amount for this, this is about $180 million this year. In the next 5 years, it would be about $1 billion. Secondly, we're asking for increases to grants. As many of you know, not all students are funded through the scholarships. In fact, most are funded through the grants. So we're really happy to see the recommendation in the Bouchard report, which we'll be talking about after, for that recommendation to increase the tri-agency's research grant budgets by 10% per year for the next 5 years. And we're specifically putting in there that we also would hope that those would allow for increased graduate student and postdoctoral pay through those grants. And this ask is about $7 billion over the next 5 years. If you're looking for specifics on this, I will flag that we just had a petition that went live yesterday to the House of Commons. This is our third of 4 petitions that we're putting through the House of Commons, and you can sign that here if you're interested. So as I mentioned, grants are actually the main source of funding for graduate students and postdocs. And this is again from the Ottawa Science Policy Network survey, where we can see that 67% of graduate students are funded through their supervisors. About 20% get those federal scholarships. And the importance of this is really that the tri-agency budgets have remained relatively stagnant. And I will kind of glaze over this, but I did want to include them in here so I can share the slides afterwards. But the budgets for the tri-agencies have also kind of remained relatively stagnant. And there's consequences for this when it comes to the grant competitions. I'll flag this one since there's an open letter group that's starting to advocate towards CAHR for this, where CHR is kind of already known to have decreased or smaller success rates for their grants. But in order to compensate for the continual kind of decrease in those success rates, they applied this 23.5% across the board cut to all the project grants in order to boost the success of the competition itself. And you can read more about this. There's some great evidence by Dr. Stephen Archer here. So the tri-agencies are kind of trying to take this into their own hands and implement things that they feel will help advocate for this. I know that was a lot. I'm sorry for glazing over most of it, but you can always learn more on our website or on our social media. We're always looking for volunteers. I always try to advocate for that. But mainly, I hope that the conversation today really starts a conversation within all of you and your university departments as well. Everyone has a role to play in the advocacy of this, and I hope that this is just kind of a starting and stepstone for Support Science. You can also reach out to me at any time. This is my email address. Happy to share any of this data or provide some insight on some of the numbers that I said today. That is it from me.
Hey, great. Thank you, Sarah. I think we're going to move. I think Dr. Bouchard has joined us, so we're going to move right. Oh, there he is. Yeah, so if you have any questions on anything Sarah has presented just now, feel free to pop them into the Q&A. We'll get to them after we hear from Dr. Bouchard. So a quick, just an intro. Dr. Frédéric Bouchard is the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Science and full professor in the Philosophy Department at Université de Montréal. As a philosopher of science, his interdisciplinary research focuses on the relationship between expertise, science, and society, as well as on the theoretical foundations of evolutionary biology and ecology. And importantly for today's discussion, he chaired the advisory panel on the Federal Research Support System that was established by the Government of Canada to provide advice on how federal support for research can be modernized. The panel consulted broadly across Canada's research landscape and early this year produced a report with a key set of recommendations. So with that, I'll pass it over to Dr. Bouchard. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I'm in a slightly different position than the ongoing conversation has been occurring. So basically, I don't have a particular issue to advocate or give special recommendations. Maybe I want to give you some thoughts that you can use, and things that I basically heard during the consultations, and that could illuminate some of your recommendations. I think these are points that were made more cogently by Sarah, and I missed the beginning of the conversation, but I'm sure you discussed this. First of all, I think it's important that we all realize that the risk of brain drain is not drives the urgency of answering the issue. So urgency and brain drain are linked, and the brain drain is caused by many forces. Of course, the lack of increase in graduate support, be it via the awards or via the grants, means that more and more students are either dropping out or going elsewhere, or completing and, as you know, just moving on away from research innovation altogether. And so I think it's important to stress, I would recommend stressing that the issue of brain drain, the largest driver is most probably the lack of increase in awards. As Sarah pointed out in our report, we stress that moving on the awards will only help 20% of the existing students, and that it's important to increase tri-council funding to really address the talent question. Also, and this is something that has only actually the pressure has only been increasing, is that other countries are, moving on this issue and very aggressively. And so it's not a question of whether, obviously Canada has made significant efforts to fund the research enterprise, but the big issue is that it's not sufficient when looking at our international peers. And that's, you can run fast, but if everybody around you is running faster, you have to pick up the pace. And so I think that one overarching issue is that we need to make research and innovation a national priority. And basically everything else stems from that. You're parts of different groups with different interests, and that's fully normal and legitimate. But I guess the overall question is, are we making research and innovation national priorities? And that the rest, then you can focus on your specific recommendations. But if we don't commit to leveling up our ambitions vis-a-vis research innovation, then any other targeted measure will, there won't be follow through. And so the larger ask, if you will, is not monetary, but is aspirational. And it's not just aspiration, it's because, we care about this. It's because Canada needs it. If you think about how to ensure Canada's well-being or prosperity for the coming decades, there isn't any growth strategy, public policy, social programs that are, none of them are sustainable without, very serious research innovation and a very healthy talent base, and that demands action. So obviously, the recommendations that have attracted most attentions are around increasing graduate support and increasing the tri-council funding. As Sarah pointed out, they're related. I mean, it's basically the same recommendation, but on two different funding instruments. But I would, and I'm biased here, but I think it's important to see those asks as part of systemic recommendations. And this is why when presenting the report to various groups, I point out that, I would advise against cherry picking within the recommendations of our report, not because we really like the report and we want it adopted whole, but because it is thought of as a whole. And we don't think that just increasing the funds would do the job. And actually, we need to increase our ambitions altogether. And that will be reflected in various ways across the recommendations that you've seen. It's also important to stress, we've seen this in one of the last slides, but basically most of the OECD data that is used to track, the performance of various countries relative to the number of researchers per thousand inhabitants, or the percentage of GDP that's allocated to research and development. Most of these indicators stop at 2020. And so you see Canada's decline either absolute or relative. But you see the Canada's decline over the last 20 years. But actually, it's even more worrisome when you look at the investments that have been made by other countries in the last 3 years. So it's the picture is bad from 2000 to 2020, but the gap will widen in the next, for the next temporal frame, because the U.S., Germany, South Korea, many countries have actually increased their investments in research and development, and Canada has not. So I think the main theme of our report, but I think brain drain wasn't as obvious to us when we were writing it as it has been since turning in the report, is that this is a national urgency. This is not, I don't want to diminish, the profound anxiety and need of graduate students, but actually what many of you will be asking for graduate students and postdocs are what's necessary for the country. So not beyond, taking care of our students and postdocs, which of itself deserves urgent action. This is a question of national interest. Canada has to be more competitive in research innovation, and that will demand a robust talent base. And that starts with our graduates and postdocs. The other aspect that some of you may be interested, and I'll explain why we didn't put a number on it. The major research facilities, so in terms of infrastructure, this is a significant investment that's needed if we want to be competitive in research innovation. But frankly, it is expensive, but more importantly, it's about commitment to sustaining those infrastructures. So it's more about the commitment through time than about the budget for any given year. And for when you think about major research facilities, you're talking about particle accelerators, about icebreakers. These are large infrastructures that are necessary to conduct some big science projects. And Canada right now is funding those infrastructures as projects, so over 6 years time frame. But these infrastructures are investments. Most of them have a 20-year, sometimes 30-year life cycle. And so we ask for more, we recommend a more deliberate approach to major research facilities, because that's what's needed to take these infrastructures seriously. Other countries, it's not just a question of dollar amount, it's commitment to the issue. And those are the recommendations again around a major research facility. My last hope and recommendation is that I think, and this is true of any issue of the type, I believe that it's important that we have a kind of a clear and simple message about the importance of the file. You have a report in hand, our report, and ideally, if the support for this report can be as simple and straightforward as possible, it means that you go from being a collection of individuals singing to a choir that have a much more powerful voice. You each have your independent needs and wants and hopes, and that's again legitimate, but hopefully, they can articulate in a coherent support for the issues that we've addressed in the report. But that belongs to you. I'm not involved directly in the advocacy. I'm just here to explain the report and some of the consequences some of the messages we've heard. And so urgency of acting on this, both for, I'd say, moral reason towards our graduate students and postdocs, but also in terms of national interest, like waiting on this puts us at competitive risk, in all aspects of how we buttress our well-being and prosperity. The major research facility, most people have not addressed this, but that may be of interest to some of you. So if you want me to address those questions. And hopefully, if you could have a kind of coherent message around the value of the recommendations, I think it would help us. It would help all of your individual recommendations, but that's not specific to the advocacy you're interested in, but it's true of any advocacy group. You need to become a choir beyond individual members. And I think I'll stop there and make myself available if there are any questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bouchard, for those comments. Very, very helpful, and certainly message heard in terms of having kind of a coherent a message across the sector, and I think certainly that is very much the feeling amongst the community right now, that it's so important that we're kind of, there might be small differences in kind of the specifics, but generally speaking, we should be rallying around kind of the same key messages.
I should, but sorry, I just want to jump in because, so I've had the opportunity to discuss with a bunch of groups, and not just academics, but industry and community organizations. So the biggest strengths of academics is also our biggest weakness, is that we're extremely good at critical thinking. And here, the perfect is the enemy of the good. I think it's reasonable people. We don't think, we don't presume that we found in all the gory details the best solution, but basically that's about implementation, and implementation takes time and serious consideration. But if we at the forefront of this discussion start picking on the things we agree and disagree with, we won't get to implementation. So this is why, we hope, we recommend, a kind of agreement at the onset. And then once the door is open for action, then you can all angle for your particular preferred instrument. But if we're not extremely coherent at the onset, the door will never be open, because what you will hear is that this is a serious issue and it deserves serious consideration, and we need to think more about this. And that means that, we're not getting additional support.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great points. Thank you. So to the audience, I think both of our speakers have very generously agreed to be here for another 20 minutes or so. If you have any questions, please put them into the Q&A. But I will start us off with a couple of questions of my own, if I may. And this one perhaps is more, it's for both of you, but perhaps more directed at Dr. Bouchard. We've been in this position before, right? Where there's been kind of advocacy that's centered around a piece of document that's come out of a report that was, established by the government to advise them, and there have been a set of recommendations, and the community's kind of rallying around it. And of course, I'm talking about the Naylor report, which was it came out in 2017, and there was a whole support the report movement around that. Do you and I think the following budget, most people would say it was a good budget for science and research. We didn't get everything that was asked for in the Naylor report, or was recommended in the Naylor report, but there was a clear it was for the most part a successful advocacy effort. Do you think that there are kind of the same elements for success now in today's environment that might be similar to kind of the situation in 2017?
I'm not going to try to, to put odds, but I think what's different is that the financial situation of Canada is not as, in not the same position. That's a huge challenge, because it means that any and all requests it's always difficult, but now there's kind of everybody's trying to lower everyone's expectations. So I think that's a big difference. But this being said, I think conversely that the pressure, especially on the graduate student, the frankly, it's a moral failure, like collectively, right? And so the kind of the moral failure of how we take care of our graduate student and postdocs has only worsened. So that adds pressure, which adds kind of significance for action. So that's a net positive. The biggest difference to me is that over the years, research innovation has been playing a larger role in Canadian economy and society. I don't think we fully appreciated how much, right? But even since 2017, I mean, just think about all your relatives that had opinions about vaccine technology, right? I mean, we've had discussions about research, like in the public, scientific experts all the time on television and so on, that has kind of raised the profile of the importance of the file. I do not think that the urgency is fully appreciated in Ottawa. The urgency, kind of the national urgency, the political urgency of helping students, I think that's well appreciated, but I don't think it's fully appreciated. The fact that if we don't move seriously on this, and forgive the language, but we're screwed. I mean, this is like Canada will be in trouble for the next decades if we don't have a strong and reliable talent base that's involved in research innovation. And this is not just about economics. This is about adaptation to climate change. It's about sovereignty and international interference and cybersecurity. And like, it's all these issues. We'll need a lot of really talented people that know the cutting edge research. And I think this is not fully appreciated. My hunch is that the ball is in play. So I think it's maybe too strong to say I'm optimistic, but I think it's not unreasonable to be hopeful. But it will depend on any and all of your interventions on this. And also, I think it's important to make clear that the issue is not just an issue for ISED and an issue for health, but this is an issue for Canada. Mm-hmm. And it just happens that the funding agencies are mainly in ISED and health, but this is an issue for agriculture, for natural resources, for social development, for, this is, and I think this is a message that needs to resonate. So if you have the opportunity, of course, Ministre Champagne and Ministre Duclos, but they know the report. But, you're across the country, do your MPs understand that this is not just about ISED and health, but this is about Canada. And this is something that other countries, Republicans have funded the US CHIPS and IRA Act. Enough said. Like, and so this is not a partisan issue. This is a national interest issue. And I'm not sure that realization has fully sunk in, but I think we're in better position than we were in 2017. In 2017, to some, it sounded like something really cool that we were able to do because we had money. And now I think we have to let it sink in that it's a necessary thing we need to do if we want to ensure our well-being and prosperity. Mm-hmm. I have spoken too much. I just want to add, because there was a question earlier about social science and humanities. I'm a philosopher, so, hand out to all the humanities people. But I will stress, this is why we explicitly wanted to name the Canadian Knowledge and Science Foundation. And this is because we don't think these challenges, when I say well-being, I don't just mean vaccines, right? I mean well-being broadly construed. I won't talk about the Greek concept of eudaimonia, but this is well-being broadly construed. And for us, and we made it very clear throughout the discussions that it was about research, science, and innovation. And research was very broadly construed because we do think that it's all necessary for our well-being. I wanted the report to add the word happiness, like to have a happy society, but I was overruled. Like I was told that that word shouldn't appear in a government, in a federal report. But that's the game. That's the end game that we're after.
I can just imagine the grumpy senior public servants who were like, no.
They thought it was cool. They just said it might alter the credibility. But basically, if we want like a safer, healthier, more just, prosperous, and happier society, you're going to need boatloads of research and innovation and the talent that can do it. There's no way around it.
Sarah, did you want to come in on any of the things that Dr. Bouchard touched on? I think, you and your group have been doing a lot of in-person advocacy, and maybe you can give us a sense of, what you've been hearing in terms of kind of the conditions we're in right now.
Absolutely, yeah. And I can just echo so much of what you said. Thanks, Dr. Bouchard. A big part that's been resonating with me recently is kind of the public perception of science as a national priority as well. Because if we want it to be an election issue, then it has to be a public issue. They have to be going to their door knockers and saying, what are you doing about science this year? How does your government view investments in research? So a lot of our work at Support of Science has been shifting gears to also include some of this like public education piece of this ask too. Even the public perception of scientists as well is an added element of this. Feedback that I've been getting from government repeatedly is that the science issue is an elitist issue, that they're the highest of society. And why would we invest in things like this right now when people are struggling with homelessness and struggling to make ends meet? So incorporating some of this into the messaging is really, really vital. And even I've had MPs say to me, oh, well, I ate mac and cheese for dinner every day during my undergrad, and like explaining to them the difference between an undergrad who's struggling to get food with mac and cheese, which is still equally as bad. But if someone's in their late 20s and early 30s doing a grad degree and still eating mac and cheese every day, there's troubling concerns there. So highlighting kind of a lot of those key elements that I've been experiencing in our advocacy. Always like these are things that you can be included in your pre-budget submissions, and the elitism is one that we've been tackling pretty head on at Support Our Science, because I think that's a big aspect of why it didn't get funded in the last budget.
Universities have never been so inclusive of different socioeconomic, and I mean, I'm saying we're far from being inclusive enough, but it's a caricature to see universities as an elite pastime of privileged people. The basic conditions of any and all aspects of our well-being and prosperity are anchored in research and innovation. And if we do less of it, we'll have less well-being and less prosperity. And if we do more of it, we'll have more well-being and more prosperity. And it's not so. I'm the way I ask the question now, I don't ask a question about research innovation, is what's your strategy for us to be more prosperous in 20 years? And, we can't sell all our water and our trees. Like how will Canada have the money to pay for its services? I focus here on the economic, but obviously I care about lots of other things, but how will Canada be prosperous moving forward? How will be, happy? And to me, that's the question. And if they say, oh, we need better jobs. Okay, well, where do these better jobs come from? Oh, we need more efficient government. Okay, how do we do that? All of that will be our masters and PhDs. Not just them, but if they're not there, well, it's just national decline.
Mm-hmm. And the timescales of that is something that's always challenging, because I think government works in such small timescales. So it is difficult to explain how the research I do today in my lab is going to make innovation in 20 years. They're like, oh, well, that's another government's problem, right? It's not mine. So there's a misconception there that is often challenging in engaging with policymakers.
Okay, so I'm gonna move on to some audience questions. The first one is, what would be more compelling to the government? Moral arguments about supporting grad students and emerging experts living below poverty line, or national interest arguments around research and innovation in a geopolitical context?
I think it's both. I think they're intertwined. Basically, is that if you treat your people poorly, they're going to leave, which hurts national interest.
Yeah,
You
no,
know,
I would say additionally is like it depends on your audience too. Like if you're talking about specific policymakers, maybe an NDP leaning person will be more understanding of like living costs and below the poverty line terminology like this. But with like liberal and conservative governments, a lot of it is like, okay, but the economic return or the numbers and values like this. So I guess it's also like they're both equally as important. We have the information and evidence for both. So I think use it as you feel is needed.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree with that. We need to be making both arguments. Absolutely. I have another question is asking about, this is more logistic, I guess, but when submitting pre-budget briefs, is it more effective to have many people together and make one submission, or many people individually make similar submissions? Any thoughts on that?
I would ask you this, Vanessa. I often think about this as well. I don't know the answer.
I think the latter. I think the latter, just because it's, we live in a quantitative age. So how many submissions were turned in to ask for X?
Mm-hmm.
And so is it, and this is, again, I'm not making a specific point about this, this issue. I do think you need umbrella organizations that make sure that they're coherent messages. I think that has a large role to play, but it's a balance. But they will think, oh wow, we've received a lot of submissions on this, and 10 submissions is more than one submission. And so, but that doesn't mean that you should all act individually, right? Because there needs to be, the nice thing about umbrella organizations or collective actions in general is that, I'm not a political philosopher, by the way, political theorist, but it's about how it helps the coherence of the message. So, there's big value in that as well.
Yeah, I think it is, at this point, kind of the number of submissions they're seeing that are mentioning the same things is really going to make a big difference here. And I do want to say that the budget process, very important, but in my presentation I also mentioned a few other places where other touch points where you could be engaging with your MPs or with other public servants, and those are important as well, because if they're hearing the same message but from different inputs, that will emphasize the importance of the message even more. So yes, do your pre-budget submissions, absolutely, but also be making contact outside of the budget process as well. Okay, any other audience questions? There's one about whether there is a way to see which previous briefs were successful, which were not. I don't think there is kind of like a check mark next to the government does, like, yes, we did this one. It's not kind of a one-to-one situation there. It's more of it's an ongoing process, and recommendations that come in are iterated on until you land on a final set of investments announcements, and that may not necessarily reflect the exact wording or the exact recommendations of pre-budget submissions. So there is not necessarily a one-to-one relationship there. I'll take that one.
If I may, and this is just kind of a psychological advice to us, or emotional, advice, but just assume that they're not going to implement your ask, right? That doesn't mean you failed. And so you have to have kind of a clear understanding of what would count as a win. It doesn't mean lower the it doesn't mean not being ambitious. But let's say you asked for, 1,000 of X and they put 850 of X. It's not failure. Like, it may not have been 850 of X if you hadn't asked for 1,000 of X. But it's very difficult when you're very passionate. I feel this way about our report. It's very difficult when you've invested a lot of thought and energy into, recommendations or an ask. Sometimes we lose perspective of what would count as genuine progress. Now, you don't want to settle for incremental. So you don't want to fall into the trap of saying, oh, well, we have to say thanks because they did something, right? No, is that something a legitimate improvement? But this will be a different answer for any and all of you. But if research and innovation deserve to be national interest and ambition, this goes way beyond a single budget cycle. But it means that you have to sustain, that energy or that seriousness to the issue in the long time frame, and that demands a different type of resiliency, and also taking the big picture. And this is genuine improvement, but we need to do more. And like, this is the type of approach. But most of you have been doing this for longer. I'm saying something trivial, but perfect is the enemy of good. Don't. You may have induced a major change, even if it doesn't appear that your recommendation was implemented.
I'll just add that I think supporter science is a really good example of that, because I think we went into last year thinking, oh, this was an easy win for the next budget in 2023. We thought for sure, after all of the stuff we had done last year, that it was a shoe-in, and many had told us that when we didn't get it in the budget, it was easy for us to kind of be like, oh, well, we lost. Do you mean we didn't get it into the budget? That's it for us. But I think it's been really cool to see the momentum come from that loss in the budget and be even amplified afterwards. And we've now gotten bigger meetings with higher up folks, or more influential people have been kind of joining as allies. And I think that was more of a win than we could have ever imagined from the last budget, was getting that momentum just to amplify the message for the following year again. And we're kind of looking at that and trying to figure out what success looked for us after the budget. Obviously, the win in the budget would have been the biggest thing, but we could have never imagined the support that we would now be feeling in the summer post-budget. So don't get discouraged. And supporter science now is a very long-term mission as we re-strategize and figure out what this means for us. But I think it's allowed us to have those conversations about what supporter science is more long-term, and it's not just a single campaign advocacy mission.
That's really, really well said, I think. And actually, we had one question that we had for both of you was, in fact, some members of the science and research community may, become disillusioned over time, feeling like, the advocacy isn't going anywhere, and not seeing the desired response from the government. Do you have any direct advice on that? I know you touched on this a little bit, but I think okay, maybe I'll answer my own question, because one thing I will say is that I think something that can be kind of missing from the science and research community and the political or the policy community is that kind of ongoing connection, ongoing relationship. Every other industry, every other sector is constantly communicating with the government, making sure that their priorities are known, making sure that their needs are known. And that is an ongoing conversation that is going on all year round. We are not particularly good at this, right? So you get into a situation where government's like, government hears from us when we're complaining about something, when we need something, and then you know that engagement dies down in between, you know, the asks, and that's not the basis for a healthy relationship in any context. So I think, you know, speaking to this kind of like ongoing, like long-term campaign mentality, that is an aspect we need to pay a lot more attention to as a community. And just coming back again, harping on, like, you know, making sure your folks are engaging with their elected representatives, and even outside of asking for investments, just making sure that they know these are the innovations and achievements that are coming out of the research that your government is funding, and look at the difference that it's making. You know, just making sure that the national priority piece is being reiterated.
This is good, and it helps us at the individual level, because if I were only asking for more money for philosophers, like self-interest is, you know, strong motivation, but it doesn't give meaning, right? So it doesn't feed, you know, it doesn't improve your life. I mean, philosophy does, but I don't mean like just asking money for your own sake is not fulfilling. And one of the nice things about remembering that this is a national interest story is that we're not asking for, it's not scientists asking for more money for scientists. You know, in a weird way, once you kind of reframe it, it's how will you improve the country? We know that we're a big part of the solution. Are you taking care of that part of the solution? And so it becomes, you know, we're doing this for all of Canadian society. And when you put it that way, you know, it's an ongoing thing. You don't get disappointed. It's easier not to get cynical, because it's just, you know, this is what it's important and has meaning. And you're not asking money out of self-interest, but because this is what Canada needs to do for all of us, right? And the reframing is actually psychologically and morally kind of healthier, because it reminds us that we're not just working for our own sake. You know, this is for the whole of society. And I think for long-term engagement with any issue, it has to go beyond your interest. And I think this is the case here.
Yeah, and even from the supporter science lens, in terms of like reframing post-budget, I think I've been realizing like how much like of an honor and privilege we've had in this in my position as exec of supporter science now, to be this voice in a world that doesn't have a voice for graduate students and postdocs. And I'm like so beyond honored to represent that right now. But I see this as such a vital point going forward, to not lose the opportunity to be that voice for other things. I see the funding and the scholarships and fellowships as our first kind of key thing. That's the urgency is there. It needs to happen now. But there's so many other nuances of this that we've heard from so many folks over the last few years. It's about international students. It's about Indigenous scholars. It's about all these people who are being left behind in all of this. And I think that these are so vital and will be allowed to be like had in these conversations because of the work and the platform that Supporter Science has built over the last year. So personally, I'm really excited for once we finally get that scholarships and fellowship asked to move on to the next things, because I think they're just as important, if not more. And I think it's amazing that we've been able to be that voice, and because it didn't really exist before Supporter Science happened. And yeah.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And I think that is a lovely place to end today's conversation. Thank you both, Sarah and Dr. Bouchard, so much for joining us today and kind of giving us a lot of ideas and guidance and wisdom on how to do this advocacy work. To our audience, thanks for coming today and joining in the conversation in the chat and sharing your questions. I hope you found this webinar interesting and helpful, and we'll definitely send some follow-up resources and a recording of this so that you can watch it back and use any of the amazing things that Sarah and Dr. Bouchard have said in terms of framing your narrative. One last thing, you'll receive a feedback survey once you sign off. We love feedback here in E4D, so please feel free to let us know any thoughts you have had on this webinar. And with that, thank you all and have a great rest of your afternoon.